Point a telescope past Jupiter, and you reach a region astronomers call empty. Star charts agree. There is nothing there worth naming. But a second Enoch passage, buried deeper than the Mars text, and suppressed even harder, does not call it empty. It calls it sealed. Not a world, a boundary. Something was placed beyond Jupiter on purpose, and the text insists it was never allowed to come back. This is not speculation. This is the text. If forbidden cosmology is something you cannot stop searching for, subscribe now. Every week we read what was removed, and never once explained. Every serious study of the Book of Enoch eventually reaches the same wall. Scholars work through the Watchers, the Flood, the Judgment of the Red World, and then they stop, because the manuscript itself stops cooperating. The passage that follows the Mars material in the Ethiopian Ge'ez tradition is catalogued under a separate heading, one that translates roughly as concerning the boundary beyond the Great Wanderer. In Enoch's cosmology, the Great Wanderer is Jupiter, the largest and slowest of the visible lights, the one ancient astronomers tracked across decades rather than nights. This passage is not part of the Mars fragment. It belongs to its own manuscript cluster, held in the same restricted section of the Axum archive. Catalogued separately from the material outside, researchers have already struggled for years to access. The Aramaic side of the tradition is thinner here than it was for Mars. Within the Qumran Cave 4 collection, a short and badly damaged fragment sits adjacent to the main Enoch sequence, designated in scholarly shorthand as 4Q212A, a sub-fragment scholars have historically treated as an appendix rather than a standalone passage. Joseph Millick, the same Dead Sea Scrolls scholar who privately referenced the Mars material without publishing it, described 4Q212A in his personal notes as requiring context not present elsewhere in the Enoch corpus. He did not elaborate. He did not return to it. Klaus Bayer, the German Aramaicist, whose reconstructions of Qumran fragments remain a standard reference for the field, listed the fragment in his 1984 catalog of Qumran texts, but left the central lines untranslated, marking them only as obscure, a term he used sparingly and almost nowhere else in his work on Enoch material. The pattern is familiar to anyone who has followed this channel through the Mars passage. A credentialed scholar encounters the material. A credentialed scholar declines to finish the thought. Devorah Demont, professor emerita at the University of Haifa and one of the leading authorities on the Qumran Enoch tradition, referenced the boundary passage in a 2003 conference paper on cosmological elements in Second Temple literature, noting that its description resists straightforward classification within known ancient astronomical models. She did not publish a follow-up. The paper is cited exactly 4 times in the following 2 decades, always in passing, never as the subject of direct study. The clearest omission belongs to R. H. Charles again. His 1906 translation, still the standard English reference for the Ethiopian Enoch, includes a short summary line acknowledging a passage concerning distant regions beyond the visible planets, then moves directly to the next chapter. Scholars who have compared his English text against the Ge'ez original estimate the missing material at close to 200 words, a gap that falls precisely where the text would be expected to name what lies at that boundary and explain why it was placed there. Charles left no footnote marking the cut. He offered no reason. The chapter simply continues, as though nothing had been removed at all. What makes this passage harder to dismiss than the Mars material is simple. Mars is visible. Anyone can step outside and find it, a red point low on the horizon, exactly as the text describes. The region beyond Jupiter is not. It cannot be seen without instruments that would not exist for another 18 centuries. A writer working in the 3rd century BCE, copying and recopying a text by hand, should have had no reason to describe that region at all, let alone describe it as a boundary, sealed, holding something in. And yet the passage does exactly that, in language precise enough that translators kept finding reasons to leave it out. Now here's where the text stops being vague. The Ge'ez text opens its description with a location, not a name. It places the sealed boundary beyond the path of the Great Wanderer, in the region where, in the text's words, the ordered lights end and the wandering stones begin. Enoch's cosmology treats Jupiter as a kind of gatekeeper, the last body that moves with clean and predictable order. Past it, the text says, the sky becomes crowded and lawless, filled with fragments that do not follow the same paths twice. That description maps with unsettling precision onto what modern astronomy actually finds past Jupiter. The planet's gravity dominates the outer solar system. It carves stable resonance zones and unstable gaps among the asteroids, the pattern known as the Kirkwood gaps, first explained mathematically in the 19th century. Beyond the main belt sits the Hilda group, asteroids locked into a 3-to-2 resonance with Jupiter's own orbit, trapped in place by gravity rather than by any physical wall. Farther out, the neat order of the inner solar system dissolves entirely into the scattered disk, a region of debris with no consistent orbital pattern at all. Order, then boundary, then chaos. That is not folklore. That is orbital mechanics. The text describes the same three-part structure without the vocabulary to explain why it exists. The passage does not stop at structure. It describes the boundary itself as cold beyond ordinary cold, and dark beyond ordinary night, a place where the text says even starlight arrives thin. Modern figures make that claim less poetic than it sounds. Sunlight at Jupiter's distance is roughly 1/25th as intense as it is at Earth. Past the Hilda group, in the transitional region before the scattered disk, that figure drops further still, and surface temperatures at those distances are estimated by planetary scientists to fall below -150 degrees Celsius. The text does not use those numbers, because the text could not have had them. It uses a simpler claim, that light itself grows too weak to matter, and cold becomes the only constant. The modern figures do not contradict that claim, they confirm it. Here is the sentence scholars keep skipping past. The Jez text does not call this region empty despite the cold and the dark. It calls it guarded because of them. The word used carries the sense of a threshold maintained, not a wasteland ignored. Something, the passage insists, was placed at exactly the point where order breaks down into scattering, as though the collapse of orderly motion was chosen as the ideal place to put something that needed to stay contained. Carolyn Porco, a planetary scientist who has published extensively on the dynamics of the outer solar system, has described the transition zone beyond Jupiter's resonances as a natural trap, a region where gravitational chaos captures and holds material for extraordinarily long timescales rather than releasing it. She used that language in a technical paper on small body dynamics, with no awareness of, and no reference to, any ancient text. The Enoch passage uses different words for the same idea: a trap, a threshold, a place that holds what enters and does not give it back. That is where the text stops describing geography and starts describing something else entirely, because a trap implies something was caught. The Jez text does not linger on geography once the threshold has been established. It moves, almost abruptly, to what it calls the ones bound at the threshold, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the surviving Enoch material outside of one place. That place is the Watcher's prison. Earlier in the Enoch tradition, in the section every scholar of the text knows well, the rebellious Watchers are described as bound and cast into darkness to await judgment, held in a location the text calls a prison of the stars. The verb used for their binding, and the noun used for the place that holds them, reappear in the boundary passage almost unchanged. Lorenz Stuckenbrook, the same scholar who has previously described other Enoch cosmological sections as startlingly concrete, noted in a 2011 monograph on the Watcher's tradition that certain peripheral Enoch fragments appear to extend the language of the Watcher's imprisonment to a second, distinct location, without clarifying whether the text intends one prison or two. He did not resolve the question. The monograph moves on to unrelated textual matters within 2 paragraphs. The Aramaic fragment, damaged as it is, preserves enough to matter here. The surviving lines of 4Q212a include a phrase Klaus Bayer transliterated but left untranslated, one that shares its root with the term used elsewhere in the Enoch corpus for those who were cast out and confined. Bayer's caution was linguistic, not interpretive. He would not commit to a translation without more surviving text. But the root is not ambiguous. It is the same root. Whatever the Jez tradition is describing at the boundary beyond Jupiter, the Aramaic tradition appears to be using the same category of word to describe it, independently, in a different manuscript, in a different language family. If the 2 passages are describing the same kind of confinement, then the boundary beyond Jupiter is not simply cold, dark, and structurally chaotic. It is, in the text's own logic, a second holding place, positioned at the edge of orderly motion rather than beneath the earth or among the stars. The modern echo here is narrower than the last one. and scholars should be given credit for treating it cautiously. But it exists. The transition zone beyond the Hilda group, the region where Jupiter's resonances stop organizing debris and start scattering it unpredictably, functions in real orbital mechanics as exactly the kind of place objects get gravitationally captured and effectively cannot easily leave. Not a wall, not a door. A mathematically maintained trap, built from nothing but the interaction of masses and orbits, that holds material in long-term, chaotic confinement at the precise boundary the text names. The specificity is what makes scholars uncomfortable. A general claim that the outer solar system is dangerous or forbidding would not be remarkable. Ancient writers speculated broadly about the edges of the world. But this text does not speculate broadly. It places its confinement passage at the exact structural transition. Modern orbital dynamics identifies as a genuine trapping mechanism, and it borrows the exact vocabulary used elsewhere in its own tradition, for beings that were judged and shut away. Now the text asks the question its own translators avoided answering. If something was bound there the same way the Watchers were bound in the stars, why has no one been willing to say so in print? And why, the passage adds in its final surviving line before the damage begins, was the fastening made so that it could not be undone? The phrase the text uses is the fastening made so that it could not be undone. That single line is the hinge of the entire boundary passage, and it deserves to be taken apart carefully because the ge'ez verb translated here as fastening is not the ordinary word for locking or sealing a door. It is the same verb the Enoch tradition uses for the judgment of the flood, and the same verb that appears in the Mars passage for the stripping away of that world's shelter. In every prior use across the Enoch corpus, this verb does not describe an object being closed. It describes a condition being set in motion and then sustained. A judgment is not an event in this text's vocabulary. It is a mechanism that continues. That distinction matters enormously once you apply it to the boundary beyond Jupiter. The passage does not describe a locked gate, a sealed door, or a stone rolled into place. It describes the fastening as something maintained by the turning itself, a phrase that, translated plainly, says the boundary is held shut not by a barrier but by motion that does not stop. Nothing was built to keep the confinement in place. The confinement is the motion. Remove the movement, the text implies, and the seal would fail on its own, but the movement, the passage insists, does not end. This is precisely how gravitational resonance behaves, and no other outer solar system dynamic behaves quite the same way. A resonance trap is not a wall. It is a repeating relationship between orbital periods, in this case Jupiter's own orbit and the smaller bodies caught in mathematical lockstep with it, that continuously reinforces itself every time the objects involved complete another circuit. Alessandro Morbidelli, whose work on outer solar system dynamics helped establish the modern models of how resonances capture and retain small bodies over billions of years, has described these zones in published research as self-sustaining, requiring no external force to keep material trapped, only the unbroken continuation of the orbits themselves. Stop the clock, in principle, and the trap loosens. But the clock does not stop. Jupiter has completed the same resonant relationship, uninterrupted, for over 4 billion years. The text was written without orbital mechanics, without telescopes, without any mathematical model of resonance. It describes a fastening sustained by motion rather than matter, at the one place in the solar system where that description happens to be literally, technically true. That is the convergence this entire video has been building toward. Not a match of appearance, a match of mechanism. And this is the point where the Hooke's question returns, heavier than when it was first asked. Every night, somewhere above the horizon, Jupiter is still tracing the same slow arc it has traced since before the text was written, and by its own logic, still doing the one thing the passage says can never stop. The boundary the text describes is not a place from a story that already ended. It is a place the text claims is being held shut right now, by the same motion a viewer could, in principle, go outside tonight and watch continue. The passage does not say what happens if that motion ever changes. It does not need to. It has already told you the fastening was made so that it could not be undone, and it has already shown you, across 4 billion years of unbroken orbital resonance, exactly what undone would require. Let me be clear about what I am not claiming. I am not saying Jupiter's resonance zones are a literal prison, or that ancient scribes possessed knowledge of orbital mechanics they could not have had access to. I am not presenting this as settled fact. Manuscripts degrade. Translators make choices. Two words sharing a root is suggestive, not conclusive, and caution belongs here as much as it belonged with the Mars material. But set the caution aside for a moment and look only at what converges. A text written centuries before telescopes existed places a boundary beyond Jupiter at the exact structural transition where order dissolves into scattering. It describes that boundary as cold beyond ordinary cold, and modern figures confirm temperatures collapsing exactly there. It calls the region a threshold that holds rather than releases, and orbital dynamics independently confirms a genuine gravitational trap at that same location. It uses the same verb for this fastening that it uses for the flood and for the judgment of Mars, and that verb does not mean locked, it means sustained. And the mechanism it describes, a seal maintained by motion rather than matter, is not folklore. It is resonance, running uninterrupted for 4 billion years. The fragment is still an axiom, the untranslated line is still untranslated. Jupiter is still tracing the same arc it traced when the words were first written down, and by the text's own account, the fastening has not once stopped since.